In front of several hundred pairs of eyes at the largest auto show of the year, Charlotte Vance, CEO of Vantara Motors, pointed directly at Mason Cole and raised her voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "And who are you, exactly? A repairman who wandered in off the street?" Laughter spread across the room. Cameras turned. Mason said nothing. He gave one quiet nod, turned his back, and walked out of the booth in complete silence, steady, unhurried, as though the room had done something to itself rather than to him. 23 minutes later, a car with no logo and no brand name rolled into the outdoor demonstration strip, and the entire exhibition stopped breathing. Keep listening to find out what that car was and why Charlotte Vance could not look away from it. The Detroit Auto Expo arrived every October like a religion for the industry, a gathering of believers who worshipped at the altar of velocity, design, and market dominance. This particular year, the show occupied the full length of Cobo Center's main hall, a space wide enough to swallow 3 football fields, flooded with studio lighting that turned every chrome surface into a mirror and every press badge into a small declaration of belonging. There was the low percussion of bass-heavy ambient music, the sharp, clean smell of new rubber, and the constant murmur of people performing their expertise for one another. Automotive journalists traveled in packs. Brand representatives rehearsed talking points in corners. Investors moved through the aisles with the slow confidence of people who did not need to ask the price of anything. It was a room that sorted people into categories without asking their permission, and it did so the moment they walked through the door. Mason Cole walked through the main entrance at 7:42 in the morning, before the first press keynote, before the crowds had fully thickened. He was 47 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent those years doing actual work rather than describing it. He wore a pale blue button-down shirt, khaki trousers, and a pair of low leather shoes with heels worn down on the outer edge, the gait of someone who stood on concrete for long hours, not someone who stood at podiums. He carried no camera bag, no recording equipment, no press kit. Beneath his left arm was a thin manila folder, slightly bent at one corner, the kind that gets carried and set down and carried again too many times to count. His press credentials were clipped to his shirt pocket, an annual renewal he had maintained out of habit long after he stopped needing it for any particular institution. He had simply never seen a reason to stop. He moved through the exhibition floor with a purposefulness that was easy to miss precisely because it was not performed. He paused at a European hybrid display for approximately 3 seconds, eyes moving from the air intake design to the wheel arch clearance, then continued walking. At a German manufacturer's booth, he crouched slightly, tilting his head to look through the lower grille at the cooling infrastructure, tucked behind it the kind of instinctive inspection that belongs to engineers and mechanics, and no one else. No brand representative approached him. No promotional assistant offered a brochure. In a room full of people signaling their importance, Mason Cole generated no signal at all, and so the room returned the favor by generating nothing back. 3 years earlier, Mason had sat at the executive conference table of Harrington Automotive at the time, one of the 5 largest vehicle manufacturers in North America, and presented a battery management system that he had spent 14 months designing. The system's thermal regulation architecture was different from anything currently in use. It distributed heat load dynamically across individual cells rather than managing the pack as a single thermal unit, which meant the degradation curve was fundamentally flatter and the safe operating envelope at continuous high load was meaningfully wider. The board had listened. They had asked questions that were, for the most part, the right questions, and Mason had answered each of them with the patience of someone who understood that the gap between a good idea and an adopted idea was not always bridged by logic alone. And then they had chosen the less expensive option, the one that worked well enough and cost less to license and integrate. The margin analysis had been decisive, and margin analysis at companies of that size usually was. Mason had submitted his resignation 11 days later. He was not angry about it, not in the way that festers into something that changes how a man carries himself. He was simply finished. Finished with the particular exhaustion of watching the right answer lose to the convenient one, and aware, clearly and without drama, that he had reached the limit of what he was willing to do inside systems that were not his own. He came to a stop in front of the Vantara Motors booth, the largest single installation in the hall. Vantara had designed their space the way confident companies design everything. Clean white surfaces, silver accent lighting, and a centerpiece that required no explanation. The Vantara Apex occupied the middle of the booth on a low rotating platform, a full electric flagship sedan that had generated cover stories on 4 continents in the week since its official announcement. The design was striking, all sweeping lateral lines and a roofline that suggested speed even at rest. A row of promotional screens displayed performance specifications in large sans serif numbers. Staff moved through the booth in matching charcoal uniforms, every gesture calibrated and every smile load-bearing. Mason stood at the outer edge of the booth and looked at the car, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not admiring the surface but reading what was underneath. He opened the manila folder, withdrew a single sheet covered in hand-annotated technical diagrams, and held it in front of him with both hands, comparing something in his mind to something on the page. Charlotte Vance stepped onto the raised presentation platform at the center of the Vantara booth at exactly 8 o'clock, and the crowd reorganized itself around her without anyone being asked. She was 38 years old, and she had the particular quality of someone for whom authority had long since stopped feeling like an effort. It was simply the medium she moved through. Her suit was the color of deep water. Her microphone was clipped to her lapel. When she began speaking, her voice carried the warmth of someone who genuinely loved the subject and the control of someone who had given this presentation, or versions of it, enough times to know exactly where the energy needed to land. The press corps leaned in. Cameras found their focus. The room performed its attention. Charlotte walked through the Apex's specifications with the ease of a pilot reciting a checklist she could complete in her sleep. Range, charging architecture, the adaptive suspension system. And then she arrived at what she described as Vantara's proprietary thermal integration system, a battery management design, she said, that represented a completely original approach developed entirely in-house by her engineering team. She quoted the thermal safety threshold, 62 degrees Celsius under continuous load. Mason stood at the outer edge of the crowd and heard that number. He did not react visibly. He looked down at his sheet of diagrams, then back at the car on the platform, and then he raised his hand. It was a straightforward gesture. Open palm, arm extended to a moderate height. The gesture of a man who had spent years in rooms where questions were asked. Charlotte saw him. She kept talking for approximately 10 seconds before allowing a pause and inclining her head in his direction. "Thank you," Mason said, and his voice was even. "Miss Vance, the slide you just moved past listed the safe thermal ceiling for the cell pack at 62 degrees Celsius under continuous load. But looking at the module architecture in your published technical release, the pack would reach approximately 71 to 74 degrees at sustained speeds above 140 kilometers per hour after roughly 8 minutes of continuous draw. Could you walk us through how the active cooling system manages that differential?" The question was precise. It was not aggressive. It arrived in the room like a correctly placed piece of furniture, something that fit and could not be easily moved. The crowd was briefly, genuinely quiet. Charlotte smiled. It was the smile of someone who had handled far more difficult situations than this one. "And you are?" she asked. "Mason Cole. With which organization?" "Independent." Charlotte let her gaze move across the room, a slow, inclusive sweep that turned the audience into collaborators, and then returned to Mason with an expression of patient amusement. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I think you may be confusing our public marketing materials with our internal engineering specifications. My team has validated these figures across more than 3,000 hours of controlled testing. I'm curious what exactly you've validated, and where in your repair shop." The laughter that followed was not unanimous, but it was loud enough to matter. A cluster of journalists near the back allowed themselves the small pleasure of it. 2 Vantara PR staff exchanged a glance that was not quite a smile and was unmistakably satisfied. Mason did not laugh. He did not flush. He held Charlotte's gaze for 2 full seconds, not a stare, simply a look, steady and untroubled, and then dropped his eyes to the folded sheet in his hand. He brought the edges together with care, pressed the fold flat, and tucked the paper back into the manila folder. A pair of venue security staff had materialized on either side of him during the laughter. Summoned by some signal Mason had not caught. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder in the practiced way of men whose job it is to move people without technically forcing them. Mason did not resist. He adjusted the collar of his shirt with one hand, secured the folder under his arm, and walked toward the exit at the same unhurried pace with which he had entered the building. He did not look back at the platform. He did not look at the cameras. He moved through the crowd as the crowd parted for him, and then he was gone. Adrian Holt was a journalist who had been covering automotive technology for nearly 20 years, first for a wire service and then for the magazine that currently employed him, AutoVector. He had been standing 2 meters to Mason's left when the question was asked, and his recording device had been running since before. Mason raised his hand, a reflex he had developed. So many years ago, it no longer felt like a decision. He watched Mason walk out through the side exit. He watched Charlotte Vance reset her posture on the platform, reclaim the room's attention with a practiced phrase, and move forward into her presentation as though the interruption had been an inconvenience of the mildest possible kind. Adrian Holt stood where he was for a moment longer than the situation required, recorder still running, watching the door through which Mason Cole had disappeared. In 2 decades of press rooms and exhibition floors, he had seen dozens of people escorted away from microphones, the angry ones, the conspiracy-adjacent ones, the genuinely confused ones. He had never seen someone leave a room with that particular quality of stillness, as though the room had done something to itself rather than to him. The north service exit opened onto a loading corridor that smelled of diesel and cold air and the specific loneliness of back-of-house spaces in large venues. Mason walked through it without slowing, pushed through the exterior door, and stepped into the thin October sunlight. Michigan in autumn had its own quality of light, pale gold, slightly flat, arriving at a low angle that made everything cast a longer shadow than you expected. He stood on the concrete apron for a moment, breathing the cold, then pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. 3 words. He pressed send and walked toward the eastern lot. The outdoor demonstration zone occupied a separate parcel east of the main building, connected by a covered walkway. Half of it was structured as a standard display lot, where vehicles sat in choreographed arrangements for photographers and inspection. The other half was a performance strip 400 meters of sealed surface with speed measurement systems, high frame rate cameras mounted on gantries, and modest bleacher seating on either side. The strip was not yet open to the public. The morning session was still running inside, but the staging area behind it held the day's demonstration vehicles in their respective trailers, some banded with manufacturer logos and some wrapped entirely in branded vinyl. At the far end of the right-hand row, backed against the perimeter fence, was a single gray trailer with no markings of any kind except a small white decal on the rear panel, printed in a font no larger than a license plate, Cole Dynamics Detroit. Mason unlocked the trailer and began removing the canvas cover in sections, folding each panel back without urgency. The car beneath it was immediately difficult to categorize. It was not a sedan in the conventional sense. The roofline was lower than that, and it was not a coupe in the dramatic sense either. It sat at a height that split the difference, and its proportions were long without being stretched, suggesting that the length had arrived as a consequence of the engineering inside, rather than as a styling decision imposed from outside. The paint was a matte, silver gray that Mason had mixed himself in the workshop, and it absorbed the morning light instead of bouncing it back, giving the car a quality of restraint that was entirely at odds with the conventions of the display industry surrounding it. There were no badges, no brand script on the trunk or the doors, no designation of any kind. It was simply itself. Violet Marsh arrived from the south end of the staging area, moving quickly in a way that suggested she had left a meeting without formally excusing herself. She still wore her Vantera lanyard. She stopped 3 steps from the car and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Violet had known Mason Cole for 15 years. They had overlapped at Harrington, for 6 of those, working within the same technical division, during a period when Harrington was still investing seriously in next-generation powertrain development, before it decided, as companies of that kind often eventually decide, that the cost of seriousness was too high. She had followed his work at a distance since then. The way you follow the work of someone whose judgment you trust, but whose path diverged from yours, at a fork you both had to choose at the same moment. She had known, in a general way, that he had been building something. She had not known it would look like this. "Lord," she said quietly. It was the most she offered when something genuinely surprised her. She walked around the car slowly, taking it in from multiple angles. The rear section was higher than the midsection, not aggressively, but enough to suggest that the aerodynamic decisions had been made by someone whose primary concern was airflow management at speed, rather than visual drama at rest. She crouched beside the rear quarter and looked at the wheel, a design she did not recognize, spoked in a radial pattern that looked both deliberate and slightly unusual. When she stood and looked through the driver's window, the interior stopped her. Every car at the show, without exception, was organized around a large, central touchscreen. It had become so universal, it was less a design choice than an architectural assumption. Mason's car had no such screen. A cluster of analog gauges occupied the center of the dash in a tight arrangement, supplemented by a single 7-inch display positioned low and slightly to the left. Everything else was material metal, a particular kind of matte-finished composite on the door panels, and a pair of seats that looked like they had been designed for function before comfort, and had arrived at both by the same route. "You're not worried people won't understand it?" Violet asked. Mason was running a final check on the rear motor housing and did not look up immediately. "The car doesn't need to be understood," he said. "It needs to be driven." He said it without inflection, not as a philosophical statement but as a simple logistical fact. Violet watched him for a moment. She had spent the last 3 years working inside a company that had learned to lead with narrative, to tell the story of the technology, before the technology was fully ready to tell its own story. It was how the industry worked now, and she had made her peace with it. But standing next to this car, next to this particular man performing a final pre-run inspection with the same care he would have given it in private, in his own shop, with no audience at all, she felt the contrast at a level she could not immediately articulate. She told him what she had seen that morning. After Mason's question, after the laughter and the dismissal, 2 engineers from Vantara's battery team had exchanged a look. She had been standing close enough to see it. Not surprise, not disagreement, but the specific expression of people hearing a truth, stated out loud that they had been careful not to state out loud themselves. The 71 to 74 degree figure was not a miscalculation Mason had made in isolation. It was a figure that had appeared in internal testing documentation 3 months earlier, flagged by the thermal validation team in a report that had been reviewed and noted, and in the eventual calculus of schedule pressure and investor timing, set aside. The Apex had launched on schedule. "I'm not surprised," Mason said. He closed the service panel on the rear housing and stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth he pulled from his back pocket. He was not angry about it, not in the way that shows on the face. If anything, he seemed less interested in the information than Violet had expected. He folded the cloth neatly and tucked it away. Before she left to return to the main building, Violet paused and asked him one more thing. "When did you register for the outdoor demonstration slot?" Mason checked his watch, a simple analog piece, black dial, no complications beyond the date window, and looked at her. 6 months ago, right after the show announced they were bringing back the outdoor strip this year. She nodded slowly. The outdoor demonstration program had been suspended for 2 years and reinstated only in the spring. Mason had registered within the first available window, months before the Apex was publicly announced, months before this particular morning had taken its particular shape. She walked away toward the building without saying anything further, and Mason turned back to the car and ran his hand once along the roofline, checking the surface tension in a way that was more feeling than inspection, the way a musician checks the tuning of an instrument before going on. Charlotte returned to the main building, without looking back. Inside the Vantara booth, the afternoon presentation cycle was already being configured updated slides, a revised media packet, the particular machinery of a product launch that still had 2 more days to run. She moved through it efficiently, answering questions from international press with the fluency of someone who had memorized the narrative at the level of the nervous system. But at one point, mid-sentence in a conversation with a correspondent from a German automotive publication, she paused for a fraction of a second longer than the grammar required. The correspondent did not notice. Charlotte noticed. By mid-morning, the outdoor strip had opened to registered spectators, and the bleacher sections were filling from the bottom up. The demonstration schedule was posted on screens at either end of the strip, listing 12 vehicles in sequence, each with a manufacturer name, a model designation, and a scheduled run window. 11 of the 12 entries listed recognizable names, established manufacturers, well-capitalized startups, a European marque making its North American demonstration debut. The 12th entry, last on the list, read simply, Cole Dynamics Prototype 1. Several people in the bleachers looked at it and then looked at each other. None of them had heard the name before. Adrian Holt had not gone back inside after the Vantara presentation. Instead, he had taken a table in the outdoor cafe near the demonstration zone entrance and opened his laptop, and he had spent 40 minutes doing the kind of research that is most useful when you already suspect where it will lead. He typed Mason Cole's name into the professional database his publication maintained, and he read through the results in the order they appeared. The career history was substantial, a decade at 2 mid-tier manufacturers before the Harrington appointment, where Mason had spent 8 years in powertrain systems and battery integration before rising to lead the thermal engineering division. The patent record was the part that made Adrian sit back in his chair. Mason held 9 patents in battery management and thermal regulation, all filed between 2014 and 2020. 4 of them had been sold in 2021 through a technology licensing intermediary called Meridian IP Group to a vehicle electronics company that had subsequently signed a supply agreement with Vantara Motors. Adrian read that sentence twice, then closed the laptop. He picked up his camera and walked toward the demonstration zone. The venue's technical certification team conducted safety inspections on every vehicle before it was cleared to run the strip. The process was standard: brakes, structural integrity, electrical systems, emergency shutoff compliance. When they reached the Cole Dynamics trailer and Mason rolled the car off the ramp, the inspection team's senior technician, a broad man named Ray, who had been certifying demonstration vehicles at various shows for 22 years, began his walk-around with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this procedure several thousand times and knew within the Clusen 40 Virus. First 30 seconds whether a vehicle was going to pass or require additional scrutiny. He got to the rear motor housing, opened the service panel, looked at the controller architecture inside, and stopped. He called his colleague over. The two of them stood looking at the motor configuration and the battery interface for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. Then Ray closed the panel, initialed the certification sheet, and pressed the approval stamp without comment. He handed the form back to Mason and said, as he was walking away, "Nice work." It was not the kind of thing Ray said as a matter of courtesy. Charlotte Vance used the break between her 10 o'clock and 11:30 sessions to walk through the connector corridor toward the outdoor zone, a habit she had developed over years of competitive intelligence, watching what other manufacturers were showing, how their demonstration vehicles performed. What the crowd responses told you that the press releases did not. She came through the glass doors that opened onto the bleacher area and paused in the threshold, surveying the strip. A demonstration run was in progress. A European crossover completing its high-speed pass with smooth competence, and the crowd was responding with the measured appreciation of people watching something well executed, but not surprising. Charlotte scanned the staging area, and her gaze moved along the line of trailers until it reached the far end, where an unfamiliar car sat in the pre-run position. The finish was unusual, a matte silver gray she could not identify with any current production palette, and the proportions were not immediately classifiable. She turned to her assistant. "Whose car is that?" The assistant checked the schedule. Cole Dynamics. Small outfit, Detroit address. No media profile. Charlotte looked at the car for another few seconds, the way she looked at everything that arrived without a context she had already assigned to it. "Keep track of how it runs," she said, and went back inside to prepare for her next session. Violet had positioned herself near the timing station at the midpoint of the strip when the announcement came through the public address system for the final demonstration run of the session. There was no music introduction, no video package, no extended brand announcement. The system operator read what was on the schedule. Cole Dynamics Prototype 1. The car rolled out from the staging lane and moved slowly toward the starting mark, and the crowd in the bleachers watched it with the particular attention of people who don't know what they're watching yet and are aware that this might matter. The car moved without sound in any conventional sense. No combustion note, no electric whine of the kind that had become the signature audio of performance EVs in recent years. There was a faint, almost subliminal breath of the pneumatic pressure system equalizing, and then quiet. The car settled at the line. The driver's side window was down, and the man behind the wheel wore a pale blue button-down shirt. No helmet, no racing gloves, no technical apparel of any kind. In the bleachers, several people frowned. A journalist near Adrian lowered her camera slightly and looked again. Adrian recognized Mason from 40 meters away. He raised his camera and set his focus. The timing system counted down in the standard format. The starting light moved through its sequence, yellow, yellow, green, and Mason Cole pressed the accelerator of a car he had built by himself over 3 years in a rented workshop on the western edge of Detroit, using money from sold patents and component sourcing decisions that had taken 8 months to finalize, and a suspension geometry he had calculated by hand before modeling it in software because he believed in understanding the mathematics before delegating them to a program. The car moved. What happened next was not simply fast. Although it was fast, the timing system would record 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in 2.9 seconds, 3/10 quicker than the Vantara Apex had posted in the same lane an hour earlier. What arrested the crowd's attention was not the number but the character of the acceleration, the way it occurred. There was no drama in it, no aggression, no sense of force being released from containment. The car simply went. The 4 motors, one at each wheel, independently controlled, coordinating through software. Mason had written himself over 16 months of evening work, produced a torque distribution so fluid and continuous that the car tracked the surface, the way water tracks a surface, following its natural path without interruption or correction. The high frame rate cameras on the gantries recorded what the eye could only partially register. All 4 tires maintained full contact with the sealed surface throughout the entire acceleration phase without the fractional slip events that are universally present in high-output vehicles executing maximum acceleration. It was not a mechanical trick. It was a consequence of the system working the way it had been designed to work. At the 200-meter mark, without warning and without any instruction from the course officials, Mason executed a full emergency brake application followed immediately by a 90-degree weight transfer, a maneuver that would, in most performance vehicles at that speed, produce a significant correction event requiring driver input to resolve. The car moved into the weight transfer, rotated to 31 degrees of yaw, and returned itself to the center line in 0.4 seconds without any visible steering correction from the driver. The crowd in the bleachers had been quiet during the acceleration phase, in the way that crowds are sometimes quiet when something is happening that they cannot immediately process. When the car returned to the center line and continued down the strip as if nothing of note had occurred, someone in the upper section began clapping. Not the enthusiastic single-person applause of someone performing their reaction, the involuntary kind, the kind that starts before the hands know they're moving. It spread in the way that kind of applause always spreads, because it is not chosen. Charlotte Vance had come back to the glass doors. She did not remember making the decision to come back. She had been in the prep room reviewing notes for the afternoon session, when something she could not have named what specifically had moved her back toward the corridor and through the door and to the railing at the top of the bleacher section. She arrived in time to see the final 100 meters of the run. She saw the car cross the finish line and decelerate smoothly, swinging into the run-out lane with the same unhurried precision it had displayed throughout. And then her assistant, standing beside her, extended a tablet showing the live telemetry feed from the strip's monitoring system, a display the show made available to credentialed technical observers. Charlotte looked at the data. She looked at one figure in particular. The battery pack temperature after the full demonstration run, including the emergency brake event, which had generated a spike thermal load, was reading 58 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees below the safe operating threshold she had cited that morning on her own stage, in front of her own cameras, with 3 years of Vantara's credibility behind the number. She did not look away from the display immediately. Beside her, her assistant was also looking at the number, and the two of them stood at the railing in silence as Mason Cole brought the car to a full stop at the staging mark and opened the door. The crowd below had reorganized itself around the car and the man, and Adrian Holt was moving through it with his camera up, recording. 3 other journalists had already reached Mason, and 2 more were cutting through the bleacher exit toward the staging area. Charlotte Vance watched from the railing. The distance between where she stood and where Mason stood was perhaps 15 meters. It felt like a measurement of something other than space. She came down to the staging area 20 minutes later, after the press cluster had thinned enough to make approach possible. She came alone. No assistant, no PR handler, no communication staff. This detail did not go unnoticed by the handful of journalists still present, including Adrian, who kept his recorder running. Charlotte stopped in front of the car, looked at it for a moment from the side, and then looked at Mason. "I didn't know it was you," she said. It was a sentence that contained more than it named an explanation, a partial acknowledgement, and a question all compressed into 6 words. "I know," Mason said. There was no sharpness in it, no barb embedded. He said it the way you confirm a fact about the weather. She asked about the thermal management system. He explained it the same explanation he had been trying to offer that morning, now expanded by several technical layers, delivered in the same even register he used for everything. The differential pressure cooling channels that ran longitudinally through each module, the predictive load-shedding algorithm that redistributed draw across the pack 600 times per second, based on anticipated heat development rather than actual heat development, and the cell-level monitoring that allowed the system to identify individual cells approaching threshold and reroute around them before the temperature was registered at the pack level. Charlotte listened without interrupting. It was the first time that day she had listened to anything without knowing where it was going to end. Violet appeared at the edge of the conversation, remaining a few steps removed. Charlotte looked at her a direct, level look, and whatever passed between them in that moment was wordless and complete. Violet had been at Vantara for 3 years. She had read the internal thermal validation report 4 months ago. She had not said anything outside of internal channels, because internal channels were where you said things. Charlotte understood this without needing to have it explained, and the understanding sat heavily. Adrian stepped forward with his printed document, a single page he had pulled from the database and condensed into the key information. He presented it neutrally to both of them, which was a journalistic courtesy and also, in its own way, a precise unkindness. The document showed the patent lineage of Vantara's licensed battery management architecture, the core filing, the transfer to Meridian IP Group in 2021, the subsequent licensing agreement with a Vantara electronics supplier. The original patent holder was listed by name. He asked Charlotte whether she had a comment. She looked at the document. She looked at Mason. Mason was looking at the car. "I didn't sell those patents to create problems for anyone," Mason said, addressing neither of them in particular. "I needed the capital to build this. That's the whole story." He said it with the tone of someone settling a minor factual dispute. He was not performing indifference. He genuinely did not seem to need anything from the moment beyond its accuracy. Charlotte did not respond to Adrian's question on the record. Her silence was its own kind of answer, and everyone present understood it as one. Then Mason turned toward her for the first time in the conversation and held her gaze without aggression and without any quality that could be characterized as satisfaction. "The 71 to 74 degree figure I mentioned this morning, your engineers had that in their validation documentation 3 months ago," he said. "I wasn't saying it to damage your product launch. I was saying it because it's a real number, and people who drive the car at extended highway speeds need to know what it means." He paused for a beat, not for effect, but because he was deciding whether the next sentence was worth adding. "You can believe I'm a mechanic. That doesn't change the temperature of the battery pack." Charlotte Vance, who had been the loudest voice in the largest room at the most important automotive event of the year that morning, said nothing. Her expression was not the expression of someone who had lost an argument. It was the expression of someone who had arrived, through a route she had not chosen, at a piece of information she could not now unknow, and who was calculating, in real time, what that meant for everything that came after today. In the 2 hours that followed, Mason received 3 phone calls on the number printed in small type on the business card, affixed to the rear interior of the car, a position that required opening the door and looking for it, which several people had done, and had then photographed and shared with colleagues. One call was from a mobility-focused venture fund whose name Mason recognized. One was from an industrial engineering firm with a vehicle development division. The third was from an individual whose first sentence established that he represented the capital allocation group of a North American fund with assets sufficient to acquire most of the companies currently displaying cars inside the main arcade building. Mason answered all 3 calls. He was courteous and brief. He said he was not in a position to have meaningful conversations that afternoon, and he took down the contact information for each caller without committing to anything. He had done this before, not with calls of this magnitude, but the structure of the conversation was familiar enough that he did not find it disorienting. Adrian Holt filed his story at 4 in the afternoon, from the same outdoor cafe table where he had done his morning research. The headline he wrote was not the one he had expected to write when he arrived at the show that morning. He had been covering automotive industry events long enough to know that the real story at any given show was almost never the story the press kits described. It was the story that arrived sideways, from a direction no one was watching, in the form of a question no one was supposed to ask. He read the headline back to himself once, decided it was accurate, and submitted it. Within 3 hours, the piece had circulated widely enough that the publication's server traffic spiked in a way that required the technical team to make a notation in their logs. By evening, 3 other outlets had published follow-up pieces citing his reporting, and one wire service had picked up the patent lineage detail, the connection between Coal Dynamics, Meridian IP Group, and Vantara Motors' licensed battery architecture, and distributed it to their full subscriber list. The exhibition began its closing process at 6. Staff moved through the outdoor zone, collecting signage and disconnecting cable runs. Trailers were returned to staging positions by tow vehicles. The bleachers emptied with the particular tiredness of people who have been standing and watching things for many hours. Violet had gone. Adrian had gone. The press corps had dispersed toward hotel bars and filing deadlines. Mason remained in the staging area, alone beside the trailer, replacing the canvas cover on the car in the same methodical section-by-section process he had used to remove it that morning. There was no hurry. There was no one left to perform for, and there had not been, in Mason Cole's particular way of operating, anyone to perform for to begin with. He worked in the fading light, which in Michigan in October is the kind of light that turns everything sepia at the edges and makes even ordinary things look like they are being remembered rather than witnessed. When the cover was secured and the trailer locked, he stood beside it for a moment in the quiet. The lot was nearly empty now, just a few vehicles and the last of the staff moving between pools of fluorescent light from the building's exterior fixtures. He did not look like a man processing a victory. He looked like a man who had brought something he had made to a place where it could be seen, and it had been seen, and now he was done. He walked to the truck cab, started the engine, and pulled the trailer out of the lot at 6:57 in the evening, turning east onto the highway access road and pointing toward Detroit in the last of the light. The car behind him made no sound as it traveled. It simply moved, as he had always designed it to, quietly, efficiently, at whatever temperature the laws of physics dictated, and not 1 degree more.